if everybody says, Islam is just and everything that, is in the Quran with regard to women is just, and the Prophet upon every peace is just, and if everybody says this and yet women are not experiencing that justice by so many measurements, there's something happening where the conversation is not meeting, even though certain words are being repeated. And so the necessity of wedding progressive, sort of paradigm shifting academic and intellectual work with the lived reality that is actually looking at the position of women in their societies. It's, there are all these indices that are out there in terms of, women's levels of education, women's access to resources, and by that I mean both material and intellectual, women's capacity to participate in the political process on par with the ways in which men are participating in the political process, and women's ability to be creative and to align their own spiritual identities with the practices that are part of the sort of projection of what is Islam and Muslims. You will see that these things are not lining up. Think about Islamic feminism within its own history. And its own history is one which reclaims both Islam and equality. It's not either you have equality or Islam, it is that you have both. And the way to do that is by understanding that Islam is a construct, and therefore to be willing to participate in the production of new knowledge about how we understand both Islam and feminism.
سلام خانم ودود، خیلی خوشحالم که در خدمت شما هستیم. همونطور که مطلع هستین در یک سال اخیر در ایران اعتراضاتی روی داد، اصطلاحاً اعتراضات زن زندگی آزادی، که یکی از پرسش‌های مهم و مرتبط با اون این بود که تا چه میزان زنان میتونن عدالت جنسیتی و حقوق خودشون رو در نسبت با آموزه‌های اسلام تأمین بکنن. همونطور که مطلع هستین شاید ما بتونیم 3 گروه رو در این مورد بشماریم. گروه اول، اگر یه نوعی بخوایم اونها رو سنتگراها بنامیم، معتقدن که آموزه‌های اسلام به همون شکلی که از متن برداشت میشه در واقع تضمین کننده عدالت جنسیتی خواهد بود. گروه دیگه در سوی دیگه طیف لایسیستا هستن که به نوعی معتقدن ما از طریق آموزه‌های اسلام نمیتونیم عدالت جنسیتی رو تأمین بکنیم، و یه طیف متنوعی از گروه ها هم در این میان قرار دارن که هر کدوم به نوعی تلاش میکنن که یه هماهنگی بین مفاهیمی از جنس عدالت جنسیتی و آموزه های دینی فراهم بکنن و از این طریق تفسیری غیر سنتی از اسلام فراهم بکنن. خوشحال میشم دیدگاه شما رو در این زمینه بدونم و نوع تفسیری که از اسلام و ارتباطش با مفاهیم مثل عدالت جنسیتی وجود داره.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin as I always begin in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I ask Allah's forgiveness for the frailty of being human and any errors that I might make. Ramadan Mubarak for all of those who are present in this month. I am not myself fasting due to age and health, so I hope I don't disturb anyone if I drink during this time. In some ways, the question that you have brought to this forum, and which many of us have, as well as the 3 groups that you have designated, has been a lifetime experience for me. In some ways, I align myself currently with Islamic feminism, but I did not always do so, obviously because of the politics of naming. And so what I want to do with you is to kind of like give you a little history. I'm sorry, I've got to set my timer. To give you a little history of really, the advent of Islam through the Abbasid period, that I'm going to jump all the way until colonialism, which I'm not going to go into any depth with, to deal with what's happened in terms of decolonialism and some of the developments which around that time also became very clear as part of the development of Reform Islam, including Islamic feminism. So that's just sort of give you an outline, where I'm going to go with it. Some parts of it are going to be, very cursory. I would love to bring more details into discussion during the question and answer period, just because my life has been aligned with this for so long. It's sometimes difficult for me to figure out how much of my experience do I have time to be able to share. So, I can go at this topic for 4 days, or I can go for 40 minutes. So I'm going to try to stay in the 40-minute range. One of the most important issues of social justice that was brought forth in the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet, upon him be peace, was the matter of women. In fact, the Quran offers more reforms on this matter than any other single social justice issue. Easily, the original trajectory could have precipitated Islam as the leading system for gender equality. Unfortunately, as the Quran was also situated in the particular context and time in which it was revealed, that context would simultaneously allow for certain cultural practices of the time to prevail. And so if you look in the Quran, for example, you will notice that there are very few women whose names occur. And when they are mentioned, their stories are often attached as auxiliaries to the stories of men, particularly the prophets' stories of antiquity, the stories of the prophets of antiquity. So there are certain linguistic nuances in the Quran that seem to not support my opening statement, and that is that there is more social justice focused on women than any other social justice issue, because the Quran still uses the language of that time and the context of that time, and therefore, for example, not naming women. But then we have this phenomena of interpretation and practice, which the two halves of it are important in terms of how this sacred text begins to be seen under the trajectory of patriarchy, and how that privilege extended sometimes over and above the Quran's own introduction to gender equality. And because, quite frankly, the reforms that were recommended by the Quran regarding women, it was not the women themselves who were the agents. They were the beneficiaries of the divine message and the prophetic examples. And that's something I will give you, sort of a spoiler alert. That's something that our time changes very differently, because women are both agents and beneficiaries of reform movements today. So, you have to kind of keep that in mind, that even though these were made, this is not something that then spurred some kind of women's movement. It was, however, interesting if you think about a text that's, over 1,444 years, from its beginning. Some of the things that happened in the Quran are, unprecedented for the time. And by the time of the Abbasid dynasty, the pervasiveness of patriarchy would erode most of the revolutionary advancement for women, which was inspired by these sacred sources. Now, keep in mind that patriarchy began before Islam. And actually, it has no foundations in Islam. But the impact of patriarchy would dominate the practice and interpretation of the sacred sources, and it would continue to gain momentum in Muslim cultures. Now, if we think about Islam as a construct, it's constructed by complex interactions between divine sources and human experiences and interpretations. So the infusion of patriarchal interpretation led to a misconception that patriarchy itself is part of Islam, and that perspective lingered for more than a millennium after the Abbasid period. I like to think about sort of 200 years leading to the Abbasid dynasty, 1,000 years after the Abbasid dynasty, to the last 200 years. And so I put like 1,000 years in the middle. It suits a nice little rubric to see how these two bookends, kind of related to what tends to be the majority interpretation and implementation of Islam. And again, thinking about Islam as a construct between the sacred revelation and human experiences with and thus interpretation of the sources, the fact that the overwhelming majority of the scholars, legal theorists, and political actors were male, naturally inclined towards, again, maintaining patriarchal privilege. And that privilege would then become authoritative. And that authoritative trajectory would then lead to a kind of hegemonic ethic. I'm going to come back to that. Now, I'm not erasing the fact that there were a minority of female and non-binary scholars, theorists, and actors throughout the centuries. It's just that even then, no one actually would begin to engage very much with the idea about gender as a critical category of thought. We had to wait 1,000 years for that category to become evidence. So by the time we get to our current 21st century, cultural norms and global discourses about gender had already been happening in all kinds of communities and had become a part of global discourses, including norms established through religious discourses, but they all presumed this hegemony and social stratification as the natural order. And this presumption with regard to gender asymmetry was not only taken for granted, it was also considered to be natural, even divine. Now, when I say that they've taken it for granted, it reminds me of this question that comes between the two first groups that you mentioned, and they still, continue to have very strong hold in different parts of different, Muslim contexts. But the linchpin is how justice was understood. And I'm going to come back to that again, but, there's this use of the word justice, there's this use of the word Islam, there's the use of the word reform, there's the use of the word of feminism, and often people think because they're using the same word, they mean the same thing. But this evolution with regard to justice is really critical to what's happening today. And what's happening today is that we're really in one of the most life-altering contexts with regard to Islamic reform, at least during the last half century. And that strongest proponent is Islamic feminism. Now, Islamic feminism, it began as a movement without a name. And some refer to the name given to global women's movements for political and intellectual attention to be given in order to dismantle inequality in the context of the nation state. So despite an undeniable egalitarian potential from within the Islamic sacred sources, as I just briefly covered, the pervasiveness of patriarchy would align so closely with hegemonic readings that most constructions of Islam would be encoded within that hegemony. And the thing about that hegemony is that really, I have to think about this historically in terms of how long this persisted, but it was a function even of sort of Greco-Roman philosophy, and that is the notion that every person has their status, or their state, or their level, or their caste, or their class, or their position, and that the only way for there to be justice is for each person to be meted out the justice that is appropriate to their status. And, there's even slavery in the Quran, and discussions about slavery often indicate that this is not a position of equality. And so, for example, punishment for certain things is half, which is to say that there is some different human status. And obviously, this is something that we had to do quite a bit about. I'm descended from Africans who were enslaved in the Americas. So this is something that I always find quite interesting, because even though, there is this practice of slavery and it's encoded in the Quran and everything, when we came to I want to say around the middle part of the 20th century, we began to radically rethink the concept of justice and also the concept of humanity. What does it mean to be a human? What is the minimal qualification that makes someone human? And therefore, we also began to think about justice as equality of reciprocity. I'm going to come back to that also in a minute. But just remember that, because from a notion of justice that says, everybody has their place and things are given to them or taken from them in terms of responsibilities relative to those places, but everybody is not the same. That's the thing people always seem to try to use in order to understand equality and justice. They think it means sameness, but literally no two human beings are the same, even when they're identical twins. So I'm not talking about sameness. I'm talking about both the responsibility to create and also to benefit from justice and human dignity. And this is very different from, you get certain things based on your class or your caste, and you're responsible for certain things, and into the same hegemonic logic, which I preface upon this sort of patriarchal pervasiveness, not necessarily coming from Islam, but when Muslims participated in that conversation, they just aligned with it. And eventually, their readings would be so intimately incorporated into, what was considered an Islamic norm, that it would, virtually go unchallenged until our time. And that challenge began as women, non-binary, and conscientious men continued to advance in their levels of education. So along with the global movements for human rights and the end of colonialism and the rise of the constitutional nation state, the foundations of all knowledge would require critical rereading. And knowledge production is one of the most important things about Islamic reform. The idea that you could take certain principles or certain trajectories, and then you would extend them in such a way that they would have a coherent and potentially transformative relationship with what is really happening on the ground. So with regard to gender, that challenge began as women, non-binaries, and conscientious men, developed levels of education and became architects or knowledge producers, architects of knowledge or knowledge producers. And then with those conversations about human rights globally, about the end of colonialism, about what the constitutional nation state means, the discourses really changed in our understanding of what justice is. So post-colonialism has led to certain forms of Islamophobia, even as it has dismantled some of the atrocities of colonialism. And since you're in Iran, majority Muslim context, and I'm in Indonesia, another majority Muslim context, I'm not going to linger much about Islamophobia, but I just want to say that it doesn't mean that everything is, just good. I mean, there's just like a lot of contending discourses that are going on and a lot of consequences for people. So when Muslim scholars and practitioners, continue with aligning our discourses and knowledge production with other intellectual collaborators towards rethinking authoritarianism altogether, we do so also with regard to the ideas about Islam and politics. And to do that, we take up, this more dynamic epistemology of social justice. Because today's notion of social justice includes human dignity, equality, and reciprocity. And I refer to this in my work on the basis of a gender-inclusive understanding of Tawhid. So the Tawhidi paradigm is one way to align with classical principles and theology in Islam in an ethic of compassion rather than an ethic of hegemony. So we're at a place now where there's such groundbreaking work that's being done, especially in terms of how to critically reread the sacred sources, but also how to really assess the communities. And I was thinking about this because there was an interesting podcast interview with Professor Khalid Abu Fadl, and one of the questions that came up was, directly about Islamic feminism. And it was really interesting because rather than talk about Islamic feminism, what he talked about was the abysmal state of knowledge production across certain sectors of the Muslim Ummah. And the reason that it's necessary to think about that is because the problem isn't just gender and it isn't just Islamic feminism. It's the way in which we actually perceive of knowledge and knowledge production in Islam. And for some people, as you know, there is this sort of taqlidi trajectory where you just continually, mimic exactly what were the discourses that went on for centuries and centuries, which, by the way, left us amazing pearls of wisdom. It's just that in the matter of gender, as I keep saying, there wasn't a critical engagement. People just took for granted what they were seeing. And to even step back and sort of unpack, what does it mean when the Quran uses a certain term versus another term with regard to gender and gender markers. That wasn't something that was a part of the discourses until, this last century or so. Not all of it, but, I kind of mark, as I say, the development of Islamic feminism with it, about 50, 70 years. And so when he refers to, this poor state of knowledge production, rather than to talk about Islamic feminism directly, it's just to say, in my mind, that there is a reason why it is that there are so many knee-jerk responses to the word feminism, in the way in which it is sometimes addressed by certain factors within our own communities. And it reminds me that my assistant created a YouTube short with just, I'm always talking about Islamic feminism, so, you know, the shorts are like less than 1 minute, right? And somebody, you know, makes a comment on there about me being a disbeliever. It's like, you can't be an Islamic feminist, you're just a disbeliever. You know, such a radical inability to intellectually engage with, in my case, you know, 30, 40 years of scholarship with regard to understanding the trajectory of Islamic feminism, which personally I believe is not going anywhere. It's only going to get better. But, you know, for tuck-feeling trolls out there, they think if they just sort of throw a sword at me and say I'm a disbeliever, that somehow everybody is going to be as thoughtless as they are. So anyway, but, you know, it's interesting because we actually simultaneously have some amazing scholarship that's being developed. And the scholarship, again, is not singularly by women, but women have taken a great deal more agency with regard to interrogation of how certain constructs are in operation in our communities. One of the most interesting things that I think that I've experienced, because I entered into feminism after, as I said, a certain period of time of resisting it, but I entered into it when my own life trajectory wedded activism with academia. And then you start to really think about how these constructs can have efficacy in the context of living communities, and, you know, how to actually implement certain things that, I mean, I think in some ways for me, they were just sort of utopic, you know, like the best of Islam is the one that sort of demonstrates these things, but nobody was living that best Islam, you know. So anyway, there's still an urgent need for more information to be, you know, shared, as in the case of here in the school, but also in terms of like publications and discourses, you know, that go on in different Muslim and Muslim collaborative spaces, that is with non-Muslims, in order to try to get away from that single exclusivist hegemonic idea of what is Islam. And that need, I think, is quite urgent. And so, you know, I think that Muslims need to think about Islamic feminism within its own history. And its own history is one which reclaims both Islam and equality. It's not either you have equality or Islam, it is that you have both. And the way to do that is by understanding that Islam is a construct, and therefore to be willing to participate in the production of new knowledge about how we understand both Islam and feminism. Now, I made a reference to the ways in which my opportunity to begin the activism of my life, which was, you know, when I first came to this part of the world, not to Indonesia, but to Malaysia, like 30, 35 years ago. And I was one of the founding members of an organization called Sisters in Islam. And it was very interesting because in 1995, Sisters in Islam participated in the Beijing World Conference on Women. And at that time, the loudest, most pushy voices that came within the discourse of Islam or Muslims, you know, and human rights or, you know, feminism were the voices that said, you have to have one or the other. You have to either have Islam or you have human rights. And the thing that was interesting is, even though there were two voices and they were opposed, one of them, you know, which, you know, followed a sort of more secular trajectory, said, we don't benefit at all from any discourses with regard to religion. Religion is inherently patriarchal, especially Islam. And so if we want gender equality, then we just have to have discussions outside of that rubric. And then the other part of the discourse was those who said, Islam is perfect. We don't need your Western colonialist, imperialist discussions about human rights. Islam gave everybody all the rights that they would ever do, and, you know, et cetera. And, you know, because they both had a very bifurcated notion of the other, they participated in the confirmation of each other. But Sisters in Islam was in a very precarious position because that wasn't our experience. Our experience, especially in formulating the organization, which is still going strong, by the way, and is also the sort of like the maternal aunt of the launching of the global movement for reform in Muslim personal status law, and that is the movement called Musawa. So Sisters in Islam is Malaysian and Musawa is global. And in both cases, the idea is that you have to wed your scholarship with an intimate, compassionate connection to lived realities. So if everybody says, you know, Islam is just and everything that, you know, is in the Quran with regard to women is just and the Prophet upon him peace is just, and if everybody says this and yet women are not experiencing that justice by so many measurements, there again, there's something happening where the conversation is not meeting even though certain words are being repeated. And so the necessity of wedding progressive, you know, sort of paradigm shifting academic and intellectual work with the lived reality that is actually looking at the position of women in their societies. It's, you know, that there are all these indices that are out there in terms of, you know, women's levels of education, women's access to resources, and by that I mean both material and intellectual, women's capacity to participate in the political process on par with the ways in which men are participating in the political process, and women's ability to be creative and to align their own spiritual identities with the practices that are part of the sort of projection of what, you know, is Islam and Muslims, you will see that these things are not lining up. And so, yes, there is a reality that counters the trajectory that I myself, you know, was inspired by the Quran to understand. And what it did for me is to kind of like take me down a few notches from that utopic location and actually talk about how strategically do we implement this equality and justice. And that's how it is that Musawa is focused on Muslim personal status law, because the heavy hand with which Islam became engaged in the law for a period of, you know, at least 300 years, and then from that first 300 years, there were all kinds of reform movements that continued, but it was so heavy that, you know, by the time, you know, we get to a certain place in Islamic history, people actually think Islam is a, you know, it's a legal religion, you know, and, you know, as a Quran scholar, that wasn't the way that I understood Islam, because for the Quran, there's less than 100 verses that you could use in order to like develop law. They're principles instead. They're values, and understanding the relationship of principles and values to the mechanisms for the implementation of those principles and values in society, to me, is a human agent. And that is aligned with the distinction that people like Dr. Ziba Mir Husseini makes between Sharia and fiqh. Sharia is the sort of esoteric, perfected trajectory or journey or straight path to Allah. It's divine, it's sacred. But we can't get at that except through human understanding and interpretation and then implementation. And that is fiqh. And fiqh is 100% human-made with that same gender bias that, you know, I talked about only briefly before. And so what we're trying to dismantle is the idea, which should not be a problem in terms of Shia understanding, you know, about the dead mujtahid. What we're trying to understand is that we are in this continual process of understanding how the principles bequeathed to us by the Quran and the living example of the Prophet, upon him be peace, how they translate into our current time. And what's our current time? Our current time is one in which the entire planet experienced a debilitating virus, completely shut down the way in which we used to do things. Now, to me, like with global warming and the environmental crisis, I consider that to be a wake-up call. But for me, that wake-up call is it shined the light on the way in which we as communities and as governments, but also in terms of communities of people, the way in which we tend to think about our humanity in still very, very radically uneven terms. We didn't come out of the pandemic transformed, but, like the, revelation of the Quran or the beauty of nature, that transformative potential is still always there, and I have to always be hopeful that we're going to be able to do this. And what that means is that we need to expand our horizons in order to witness the complex unfolding within Muslim histories and continue with the dynamics of knowledge productions, as was inspired even by the first word of revelation, Iqra, or read. So from this, we would understand that we need to be working with an egalitarian analysis and ethics that builds on our capacity and raises awareness across Muslim thought that there is no single definition of feminism, just as there is no single definition of Islam. And when we do that, we stand a better chance of engaging in continued dynamism with regard to knowledge production, because that kind of investment requires a certain amount of political will, as well as political freedom and mobility. And at the same time, it requires us to engage in depth, in complex, and sometimes complementary, and other times contradictory assessments of how it is that we engage with the matter of Islam and gender.
شما دیدگاهی که فراهم کردید به این شکل بود که در واقع با تفسیر جدیدی از اسلام تلاش بکنیم اون تغییراتی که به دلیل تفاسیر تاریخی به وجود اومده در واقع حامل یه نوعی از ناعدالتی جنسیتی بودن رو کنار بزنیم و متن مقدس رو به همون شکلی که در گذشته بوده بنابر مفاهیمی بر دارنده عدالت جنسیتی مجدد تفسیر بکنیم. خب بعضی از منتقدین معتقد هستند که آیاتی از قرآن مثل آیاتی که در مورد زدن زنان هست، اینها به شکلی صریح دارای مضمون و مفهوم خلاف حقوق زنان هستند که اساساً این موضوع تفسیر بردار نیست و به نوعی معتقدن که این انتساب همه تبعیض‌های جنسیتی به تفسیرهای تاریخی دیدگاه نادرستیه. ممنون میشم دیدگاه خودتون رو در این زمینه بفرمایید.
Yeah, I spent a whole lifetime working on those verses, especially the one 434. Yeah, I mean, like literally a lifetime. And in that time, I have gone from what I would consider to be my own apologetics to actually have a chapter in my second book, Inside the Gender Jihad, that if it doesn't sound too provocative, it really amounts to how do we say no to the text? And it's a methodology. And that methodology is simultaneously an active human participation in recognizing that it is always humans that interpret text, and that the application of anything in the text is prefaced upon the ability of that application to fulfill those greater principles of justice, human dignity, compassion, and equality and reciprocity. And so what ends up happening is the best method of understanding how I got to the place where I stopped apologizing and instead just say, note to that verse, not to the verse, but to beating women, is that I did work with Musawa teams and knowledge building projects to really make an assessment of the impact of this verse throughout Muslim history, including throughout the history of tafsir. Later, there was a publication of an amazing book called Gendered Ethics that, you know, helped me to even understand it with regard to the field of philosophy and ethics. But the linchpin was always whether or not the justice that's implied by everybody as part of the Quran everywhere, again, taking into consideration that not everybody defines justice the same way, but that justice was going to be in the hands of the women themselves to determine. And what you do with that is you look at the history on all of the research about GBD, gender-based violence, and you see that there is no way to do justice to a woman, even if the jurists used to say things like it's Ramzian, it's symbolic. The very notion that you might be hit, the very notion that you might be hit verbally, which was not a part of the, I mean, there's interesting, I was just doing, trying to keep up my Quran reading with the move, and there's actually such interesting things about, you know, things that people speak with their mouths and, you know, the impact and all of that, that it has on others. But, you know, the ways in which women experience violence has to become the center of how we consider what is gender-based violence. And as a consequence, if the intention as elaborated by the fuqaha, by the jurists, of no harm, you don't do harm, it's symbolic, you know, if that's the intention, it cannot be determined by men. It has to be determined by women. And when that happens, you realize there's no possibility of reducing harm. And so you have to simply say, yes, this is in the Quran. And yes, this was part of the understanding of the relationship between women and men at the time of revelation, but it is not eternal. And then you look and you see that other mechanisms are provided in the Quran itself, in that verse, as well as in a verse, you know, verse 4, 128. So you start to see that we're not fixed to the place where every single thing that's in the Quran, we have to do it exactly the way everything is in the Quran. Because, as I said, my thing is always looking at slavery. It's just like, I mean, I personally don't know anyone who believes that slavery is okay as an institution, and yet it was okay when the Quran was revealed, and it was okay even in the practice of the Prophet, upon him be peace. So some things happen with regard fundamentally to the ways in which we understand humanity and human dignity. And so, yes, that verse is there, and yes, that verse is very sticky, and yes, that verse requires a great deal of unpacking. Again, knowledge production, but it is only one of about 5 or 6 verses that even confirm notions of, you know, inequality out of 6,600 plus verses. So even though it's a huge verse, and I've given it a huge amount of time in my own research and my own activism, it's not the totality of the Quran. And to me, the totality of the Quran requires us to engage not only with sticky passages, but also with ambiguity. It's my new thing. My new thing is I'm working on this thing about ambiguity. That sometimes, you know, and I find it especially when I'm doing the quick read for Ramadan, sometimes, you know, I'm just like, you know, sort of bowled over with the contradictions about things, you know, that come up in the Quran. And that's because I'm reading a certain passage at that time, and within it sometimes is you know, like certain juxtapositions, you know, like in the beginning of the Quran, you know, they talk a lot about disbelievers, and then they start talking about munafiqun and the hypocrites, and then they start talking about people of the book, Jews and Christians, especially as the Prophet experienced, you know, these communities in his time, and it's scathing. It's just scathing. I get exhausted reading it, you know. And And yet that's not the totality of the Quran. So the Quran is also situated, and we are situated. And the Quran did not mean for us to ride camels from here to eternity. I mean, you know, we're going to have the flying cars that are run by electricity and all that kind of stuff, you know. So I really believe that it is that thing about knowledge production that helps us to grapple with these things, and also because you must directly engage with them. It's not about avoiding them, and it's not about, you know, with me, I was in such a euphoric state with becoming Muslim by choice, and then I spent, you know, 10 years preparing and studying the Quran, you know, for the Arabic masters and the PhD and all that stuff. So I was in a very idyllic state. I'm not in that idyllic state because I worked with women in communities and myself experienced, you know, domestic violence in a marriage. So I, you know, like the rose-colored glasses are off. Now they're tinted a little bit blue in order to work with the computer. So, you know, we do, if there's some work, you don't avoid the difficult passages, but sometimes it takes work. And in my case, I want to say that verse took a good 20-25 years. No doubt.
شما دیدگاهی که بیان میکنید این که ما در واقع در مورد آیاتی که حالا خلاف این تفسیر هستن ما بگیم نه و اونها رو کنار بذاریم، خب نکته که وجود داره اینه که ما داریم در مورد یک کتاب مقدس صحبت میکنیم. طبیعتا کتاب مقدس برخلاف کتابی که ممکنه انسان‌ها نوشته باشند و ما اونجا به درستی میتونیم از تقدم کلیت بر اجزا صحبت بکنیم، در مورد کتاب مقدسی که خب تو بعضی از آیات صریحاً اشاره کرده که چون تعارضی درش نیست پس از جانب خداست، این بیان مشکلیه. شما این اعتقاد رو چطور پاسخ میدید؟
Yeah, that's only what people who don't study the Quran say. There are contradictions all over the Quran. There are contradictions everywhere. And the reconciliation of those contradictions has been a part of the scholarship of tafsir, you know, from the beginnings of the ulum al-Quran, from the beginnings of the study of, you know, sciences of Quran. Contradictions in the Quran is like this thing with ambiguity. I mean, I really think Allah has a sense of humor. Sometimes it's there to challenge us. Because then we say, oh, well, it's a sacred text. Some say it's written by God, some say it's by God, or whatever the heck it is. So there cannot be contradictions. Contradictions, my dear, are a fundamental part of life. The Quran is not anti-life. So reconciling contradictions is about human agency. And I'm not afraid of contradictions. I'm not looking for everything has to say exactly. Didn't I just give you the examples of my, you know, sort of Quran Ramadan reading? You know, it's just like, oh my God, I don't even understand how this thing goes. You know, so the thing is that we're afraid to accept that there can be contradictions in the Quran because we have a truncated understanding of what is perfection with regard to sacred texts. We think the Quran is Allah, and as much as I love the Quran, it is not Allah. And even if we consider, which I do consider, that Allah is the author of the text, this is one of the places where understanding how human language is itself produced in time. It's a construct. And because we're using human language as our primary tool for understanding, we then expect of it something that cannot be done by language, and that is arrive at, and in fact, a perfected non-contradictory state. So sometimes the most important thing is how to resolve those contradictions. Instead of exploding into a paradox, it is how it is that they come into dynamic conversation with each other. We call this tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, the Quran as tafsir of itself, but also, again, only through human agency. Because my reconciliation of something today may not be sufficient for what I encounter with regard to different understandings of it tomorrow. So yes, there are contradictions in the Quran, but their reconciliation has always only been human. And that is because there's no way for Allah, who is metalingual. That is, Allah does not speak Arabic. I'm contradicting my own sheikh, who gave a talk before Ramadan about the beauty of the Arabic language. He's a white American. It's not like he's an Arab. The beauty of the Arabic language and how, you can't get the same experience with the word God as you can get with the experience of Allah. And I just thought, oh my God, I love you, Sheikh, but I don't agree with that at all, because language is our most powerful tool of knowledge production, our most powerful tool of understanding, our most powerful tool of transformation, and yet it is still imperfect. Imperfect. There is no language that can capture and hold on to perfection. None. So just because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala communicates with an Arab, it has to be in Arabic. He can't do it in Farsi, he can't do it in Dari, and he can't do it in Black English vernacular. It has to be in that language. That doesn't make Arabic perfect. Oh my goodness. So in fact, it's sort of like the difference between Sharia and fiqh. One of them is sublime. It is in fact perfect. And the other one is the reality of what it means to take that sublime message and trajectory and try to live it in real terms. So there is truth, capital T, and haqq, but it can only be communicated to us humans through that which we understand, which again is principally language, and all languages are imperfect. So I think it's really an important question, and it does go back to the philosophy of how we understand what is the nature of wahi. But as far as the gender situation goes, we have to give a fair shake to, I don't mean shake as in shake or shayukh, but I mean we have to give a fair amount of attention to how certain things are used to manipulate the gender discourse. The gender discourse did not begin and end with those 6 problematic, in my estimation, passages. The gender discourse was long before those passages, and those passages are then sort of retrospectively used to justify the hegemony that was already in practice, already being promoted, already seen as natural, divine, sacred, whatever. So we really have to understand, if we are not able to engage with the Quran in a way to understand its own complexity, we can't refer to the Quran when we're trying to solve certain problems. And one of the results of this knowledge building project in Musawa, with regard to 434, that passage, was an unpacking of the term kiwama, ar-rijalu qawwamuna 'ala an-nisa. That's how the passage, the ayat starts, and it ends a little bit after wadrubuhunna, and strike them. And in the research that was done by Professor Dr. Umaym Abu Bakr from Cairo, she actually shows how initially it's clear that the term qawwamuna did not lead to the construct kiwama. But the construct kiwama now is set in gold and stone and whatever. But if you watch just the tafsir trajectory in terms of how that term evolved, from it not even being a concept to it being a solidified concept, you will find that the mufassirun in each, let's just say generation or sort of intellectual context, they augmented their already fixed position of men are superior to women because God has granted men all this, goodness over women, and therefore men should beat them. Instead, they start to bring in new things each time. So, one of the most recent things that they bring is psychology. And when they bring in psychology, none of them are experts on psychology. They will say, it's the nature of a woman. It's the nature of a man. He wants to lead. He has to have more than one wife. And I'm like, who is defining this? Oh, a bunch of men. And when they're talking about their nature, I'm going to do like Maya Angelou said. I'm going to listen to them. But if you're going to start telling me about my nature, I'm sorry, you're not in this body. And yet, because we do have the sacred bond between us that we want to be able to participate in. I mean, I'm your world's, last romantic, We sometimes think that the way to be able to achieve that is, well, I'm just going to go along with what it is that's culturally accepted to make me a good Muslim woman. And I have studied this phenomena of the good Muslim woman from a long time back. Because the good Muslim woman is projected as A, B, and C. And you look at yourself and you say, oh my goodness, I'm A, C, and R. So I'm going to have to eradicate my R and get me a B if I want to be a good woman. Well, why can't a good Muslim woman be A to Z? Somebody has made this narrow path, and women have tried because we're really nice people. We really like to get along with you guys, So when we are trying to understand how the Quran participates in patriarchy, we need to unpack each of the components, because as I said in my talk, patriarchy became so pervasive, we had a hard time separating it out. And then those, first of all, who hate Islam, or those who hate women, they would take these verses and they would blow them out of proportion from 6,600 over passages. So it's a very interesting question, and it's a very important question. And to my credit, I have been teaching the methodology for reading for gender since my retirement, because you can't do it in one lecture. You can't do it in one, week's, intensive course. It's an ongoing process. So thank you for the question. As you can see, I really liked it.
من علاقه‌مندم این سوال رو به یه شکل دیگه مجدد از خدمتتون بپرسم. خب ما آیات شاید به یه بیانی مبهمی در قرآن داریم. فرض بکنید همون موردی که شما مثال زدین که بحث قوامون مطرح میشه. خب ما اینجا میتونیم در مورد تفسیر کردن صحبت بکنیم. اما از جمله آیاتی که من در سوال قبل هم اشاره کردم، خیلی از اینا عباراتی هستن که فضای اجتماعی، هر شخصی که آیه رو ببینه، هر انسان معمولی آیه رو بخونه، کاملا متوجه محتوای اون میشه و بعضی از منتقدین معتقدن که اینها به وضوح و به صراحت علیه حقوق زنان هستن. خب در این حالت اگر ما صحبت از این بکنیم که ما این آیات رو باید نادیده بگیریم، بگیم نه این آیات فعلا بشن کنار، خب این رو نمیتونیم یه نوع تفسیر یا یه نوع برقراری هماهنگی بین اجزای قرآن بدونیم. در حقیقت ما داریم یه بخشی رو کنار میذاریم به جای اینکه بین اون و بخش‌های دیگه هماهنگی ایجاد بکنیم. خب دیدگاهی که به صورت سنتی این رو تفسیر میکنه به نظر میرسه که دارای نقد خاصی نیست. خب میگه همه آیات قرآن از جانب خدا هستن، این آیه هم به همین شکل بیان شده، پس بنابراین دارای مشکلی نیست. ولی وقتی ما میخوایم تفسیر بکنیم، یکی از الزامات تفسیر اینه که خب اجزای مختلف رو حفظ بکنیم، نه اینکه اونها رو کنار بزنیم. و من برداشتم از صحبت شما این بود که ما با یه نوعی از کنار زدن فقط میتونیم مشکلی که بیان شد رو حل بکنیم. و خب بعضی از منتقدین معتقدن که در واقع این اصلا تفسیری اینجا رخ نداده و ما یه نوع انتخاب سلیقه‌ای بین آیات قرآن رو داریم، یعنی دسته‌ای که اون رو میپذیریم، بهش علاقه‌مندیم، و دسته دیگه‌ای که نمیپذیریم. حالا شاید این رو یه جوری تفسیر به رأی بیان بکنن.
Yeah, so I don't personally advocate for removing anything from a historical text ever.
نه، منظور من از حذف نگفتن یا کنار گذاشتن آیات بود.
It's like let me don't give me more because I'll never be able to remember it. Okay, it's like we're a Muslim country, so we're going to like destroy all these Buddhist statues. No, we accept the Quran, we accept the whole of the Quran, and yet, for the purpose of implementation, for the purpose of practice, we do not practice slavery. So it means we have already made decisions not to practice certain things. And that's exactly what we continue to do. But we leave it in the Quran because we say the Quran is also, as I said, historically situated. The other thing is this. Within the field of, Ulum al-Quran, Quranic sciences, there is, okay, so you've listed a few things, which I think you're dwelling on awful long about there are no contradictions, which I don't believe that. I didn't find that. So I'm going to not go there. Instead, I'm going to go to this, and that is khas wa am. This is something that the Mufassirun came to the conclusion. Some verses are very khas, very specific, and some verses are very general. Now, they didn't say what's universal, and I'm not going to go to that today. I'm just going to deal with the khas and am. So the Quran is very explicit. It says, to Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, mothers of the faithful, these were the women who were in marriages with the Prophet, upon him be peace, that you cannot marry after the death of the Prophet. This is not a general ruling. This is not something that every Muslim woman should think that, okay, when my husband dies, I should just throw myself on the funeral pyre, just like in the practice of Safe in certain Hindu, expressions. No, it's not a general rule. It has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of us. Very, very, very specific. So, between a khas verse and an am verse, a general verse, this has to do with sort of like, if somebody doesn't pick up the trash, your city or your town, becomes pretty dangerous environmentally, Somebody has to do it, but not everybody has to be a trash collector, okay? So trying to understand with regard to the Quran and with regard to how we resolve certain very, very, very important and real issues like gender equality and justice, reciprocity and human dignity, and compassion, all of that, again, is an active process, because you could take this, which is the way I now do, as an expression of the way in which the practice of marriage was going on at that time, which I used to call the marriage of subjugation. The presumption that the woman was subject to the husband was pervasive. Pervasive. It's not divine, it's just a practice. And people have practiced other ways, and people continue to practice other ways. So if we are looking at expressions with regard to that particular time, or the circumstances where the Quran does revelation after a battle, and because that was a battle of loss, there's all this conversation about, people, sticking to the path, and those people who say, oh, I'm so glad I didn't go to that fight, and now I'm fine, and I didn't get killed, and the Quran is like, you will be killed whenever it's your time to be killed. So trust me, just because you didn't go there doesn't mean you're not going to be. It's very, very specific to that time. You can glean certain things from it, but it's very difficult to try to make application in today's terms. Cut off the hand? I mean, no. Okay? But that was the practice then. It's not like it was made up. The Quran didn't introduce it. Okay? So we really have to understand the Quran as both a product of time, in time, a specific time, a very khas time, and a trajectory of eternal hikmah or wisdom or guidance or truth. You cannot do that if the only way you know how to read the Quran is literally. You cannot do that. Now, when you are not reading the Quran literally, how are you reading it? What are the limits of where you go? People always ask me this. What is the limits? I say, why do there need to be any limits beyond hududullah? There are no limits. Every single thing is up for question, and every single thing is up for conversation, and every single thing is up for, I want to say ghad, anger. I was so angry for a long time that verse even existed in the Quran, but I kept grappling with it. And when I went to South Africa in 1994, they asked me about my methodology, and then later on they said, oh, she's advocating for removing certain things from the Quran. I'm not, no, leave it in there. It serves us so much better purpose being in there. However, that purpose means you engage with it and you don't write off the other 6,607 verses because of it. Because what you understand is the Quran has to deal with a variety of audiences over a variety of circumstances, some of which we have not yet even gotten to. And so there is this multi-pronged approach. Multi-pronged, okay? Don't know if you have children. My children are all having children now. But I realized when I was raising my children that enticement was a much better incentive than punishment. So if I encouraged them to do certain things, they were more inclined to do that thing from the positive encouragement than for me to be angry about something. And then when they got to be teenagers, oh my goodness, it was so difficult. And I really wanted to start like laying down the law and everything. Well, it was too late. I had just created all these free thinkers and, you know, and that's when I understood the parts of the Quran that's very difficult for me to read as far as my own personality goes, you know. And that is, there's some people who don't listen. And so you get a message. But again, 6,600 some verses, that is not the totality of the Quran. That is not. And so there is this constant grappling with what is actually there, what was the circumstances, what they call asbab nuzul, what were the circumstances, not just the literal reason, but rather the contextual understanding. And then there's all the context of the revelation itself. How is these terms used in the Quran? There's so much that goes into the reading of the Quran, but none of it is any use if you cannot implement it for the cause of justice and good and truth and dignity. So yes, there are difficult passages. Yes, there are contradictory passages, and they will be there forever. Because what? Contradiction is one of the natural phenomena of being human, and we need to learn to deal with it and stop pretending there is a black or white answer to everything. And if you don't give me a white answer, I'm leaving you. No, I'm going to grapple with it because, you know, I was given this capacity as a sentient being to reflect on it. I'm not a robot. I'm not artificial intelligence. I'm not even that intelligent. I'm intelligent enough to know that there's a partnership between me as a person and Allah as the giver of these gifts. And if I'm not doing my part, and if I'm blaming it all on Allah, and the only way I can get free of it is just to remove something that Allah says, then I'm not really trying very hard. I'm not really trying very hard. And I mean, you know, I've been an adult as a Muslim because I converted at the age of 20. I've been actively engaged with Quran for 50 years. 50 years. And guess what? I still love it. I mean, you know, there's no way for me to explain it. So, you know, yeah, I mean, I think it's easy for people, you know, sometimes as a Quran scholar or working with Musawa or with Sis, people want an easy answer. Well, what verse do we tell them? Oh, my goodness, baby, if there was one verse that could solve the problems of the world, I would be reciting that verse all the time. But there is not. We created the problems and we have to fix them. There's no easy answer. We're not going to get rid of gender inequality because we have a different verse.
خانم ودود، من سوالاتی که تا الان پرسیدم شاید بیشتر از دیدگاه کسانی بوده که منتقد تمامیت اسلام هستن. میخوام چند نکته رو یا سوال رو از دیدگاه کسانی که این مقدار تفکر سنتی یا تفسیر سنتی دارن از شما بپرسم. من میخوام ببینم که آیا در تفسیر شما از اسلام یه نوعی از خط قرمز وجود داره که ما بگیم که نمیتونیم از اون فراتر بریم، به مرور زمان این رو تایید نمی کنیم، یه جوری اون رو داخل تفسیرمون از اسلام وارد نمی کنیم. اینو به این جهت میپرسم که خیلی از دیدگاهایی که تفسیر سنتی از اسلام دارن، حالا دیدگاهایی که اونها رو سکولار مینامن رو متهم به این میکنن که این افراد میخوان به نوعی ارزش‌های غربی رو وارد تفسیر از اسلام بکنن و اینجوری یه تفسیر جدیدی از اسلام ارائه بدن.
Oh my goodness. It's so stupid. Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. It's so stupid. The whole idea that you can reduce everything you dislike to being Western, That's like the Islamophobes reducing everything they don't like to Islam. Okay, so this is important.
نه من میخوام به صورت دقیق از شما بپرسم که آیا یه نوع ذات و خط قرمز برای اسلام میتونیم تفسیر بکنیم که مطمئن باشیم با مرور زمان به هیچ نحو ما از این خط قرمز عبور نمی‌کنیم؟
According to the Quran, somewhere in my, last week of reading, that Allah can forgive anything except for shirk. Shirk is the border. It's the reddest of the red. Beyond that, everything else, according to the Quran, can be forgiven. So, no. I don't believe in anything other than hududullah, and I don't think I can implement hududullah. If we start putting borders anywhere, we deny ourselves what is beyond that border. And just because we deny ourselves does not mean that other Muslims or others who hate Islam are not going to go there. So, no, I don't believe in borders at all. The bottom line is shirk. And I am more metaphorical about understanding shirk. By that I mean, sort of the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. That shirk is the idea that somehow Allah doesn't have the capacity to reveal a text in human language beyond contradictions. No, that can't happen because human languages have contradictions, But I'm just saying that, shirk is like the entire universe is organized in accordance to unity and beauty and harmony. And when you violate that unity, that harmony, and that beauty, you corrupt the entire universe. So shirk is not just a religious thing. I just unpacked my, I shouldn't say this, but I have a statue of Lord Ganesha. My spirit animal is an elephant. And when I lived in India, I really came to understand Lord Ganesha. So I always keep one in my house. But, I descended from Celtic Christians. I have the Celtic cross on my altar. I have an altar. I now define myself as an eclectic. Excuse me. Eclectic. And that is everything that Allah has given me is part of the ayat of Allah. So I'm the worst person to ask about hudud, because I do not believe that hudud means guidance. Guidance means, what do you do in the dark? What do you do when the lights go down? So I'm not for removing anything from the Quran, nor am I for restricting the effort to understand and to be in discourse with anything that's in the Quran. Open book, completely. Because that's the only way for you to reconcile the contradictions. If you already put a limit on yourself, you could miss like a very, my recent research is, and I'm an advocacy about LGBTQ and Islam. And when I began the research, so of course I began with the Quran, and then I did tafsir, and then I did hadith and seerah, and then I did fiqh. I was so disappointed that no matter how many ways I read the 7 major passages about the people of Lut, that I couldn't get an answer that was as definitive as the answers that I got when I was doing gender. I was so frustrated. And then I realized, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. You need to stop pretending there is a black and white answer. And you have to return to the fact that there will be no answer to the human dignity of non-binary people until it is given by other humans. And it became so much easier because it's not like, Allah is perfect, so why isn't there a perfect statement that says, don't kill somebody because they're attracted to the same sex? It's like, why is there not a verse that says that? And so I really learned there's spaces in between each of the words. And there is elliptics. There are things that are absolutely missing. And yet, as they're missing, if you follow the pattern, the trajectory of the harmony and the beauty and the whole of the creation, you will see how to fill them in. And that puts you in partnership with Allah. Interpretation is not how much Allah understands Allah's words. Interpretation is how much do we understand it. And understanding for us in the context of Islam and surrender is not just what's in your head. It's what you do with your body. And what you do with your body has something to do with other bodies on this planet, which for now is the only one that we know for sure is inhabited by other beings. So I think Islam is a transformative process. And I think understanding the Quran is part of that transformation. But I do not think there are easy answers to difficult questions just because there are 6,600 and some verses. There's a lot of stuff that's not there that I wish was, but it's not in there. So that means that I have to understand how to do it myself. So as far as gender goes, one of the things that you really need to understand is that there are simultaneously those problematic passages, but a lot more of those passages that offer a kind of vision of equality and reciprocity, muwaddatan wa rahma, love and mercy, libasukum wa libasuhinna, protecting garments to each other. Those did not become the foundation of our understanding of gender relations, and yet they are wadih liwuduh shams. They're very clear. So we selectively chose towards the hegemonic, patriarchal readings because that's where we were as a civilization, and it is my hope that we're going to do better.
سوال دیگه من این هستش که آیا ما تفاوتی بین فقه و گفتمان شیعی با فقه و گفتمان سنی ها برای فائق اومدن بر این تعارضاتی که شما ذکر کردین رو داریم؟ آیا تفاوتی بین اینها در مورد تواناییشون برای هضم این تفاسیر جدید وجود داره یا خیر؟
Well, first of all, I personally believe that the scholarship within Shia scholars, especially in terms of reform and everything, is leap years ahead of their Arab brothers, mostly brothers, but a few sisters. But obviously there are Arabic Shias as well. However, because I don't know the original language, I don't know Farsi, everything that I've ever had has always been given to me secondarily, usually through English and sometimes through Arabic. So I'm not an expert on it, but I do participate in collaborations with Shia scholars, and I find that you know, there's this capacity to understand nuance and contradiction that is much more organic. And I do think that it has something to do with the language, because Farsi, like Bahasa Indonesia, where I am, has only one pronoun. One pronoun. And so people don't like lose their mind when I say Allah she. People lose their mind when I do that. And they're like, how can you do that? I said, it's just a pronoun. And when you do that here, nobody has a problem with it, because Indonesians don't have he, she, and it. And so when they're trying to make a sentence that involves talking about a woman, they will very often end up saying he, because it's just too much work to go in that little vocabulary of your brain and take out the designation she, you know. So they'll say, oh, my husband, she. It happens every time they're doing the translation. I find it funny, except that what it does do, which is similar to Farsi, what it does do is you actually fundamentally have a way of understanding that's based on unity. It's based on unity. And yet, you know, people say about Rumi, because again, Rumi for me is always secondarily, I mean, a second language. I don't, you know, I've heard it recited in, I've heard some of the Magnabi in Farsi by recitation, but I don't understand enough to do it, you know. But people say, oh, yes, Rumi is very clear on what's the he and what's the she and everything. And I just thought, I'm not even believing that, but I'm just going to have to like agree, because it's not my area. And I have not studied enough to be able to give you a more than sort of like an intuitive response. I think that it's not just Sunni and Shia, though, you know. It has to do with sort of like linguistic, philosophical ethical, spiritual communities. And one of the things about at least the Iranian context of Shia expressions is you've had one of the most tumultuous histories. And because you're still living in those histories now, you're still responsible for reconciling so many contradictions. And I think in a way it has, maybe again I'm being utopic, but it has created a subtlety. I mean, I respect more male Shia scholars than I respect, well, I'm going to say Indonesians, and they're mostly Shafi'i Sunnis, you know. The Shia scholars that I know, you know, I'm just amazed at some of the ways in which they think. But again, second language, and it's usually not tafsir per se. It's usually more fiqh. So I say all of that to say I don't know, but I have an intuition with regard to it. And that's as good as anything for now, but I wouldn't try to pretend that I have actually done a coherent survey of, you know, Shia tafsir versus Sunni tafsir. I've never done that.
خیلی ممنونم از شما. گفتگوی خیلی خوبی بود. من از شما میخوام که اگر نیاز هست خلاصه‌ای بیان بشه یا نکاتی باقی مونده که علاقه‌مند هستین اونها رو با مخاطبان در میون بذارید بیان بفرمایید که بتونیم گفتگو رو جمع‌بندی کنیم.
No, I just want to say something that maybe because I'm an old woman now and I, you know, have to think about, you know, I'm so much closer to the grave. I just want to say that I truly believe that when the Prophet said, you know, istafta qalbik, to take fatwa from your heart, that the kinds of things that Rumi talks about all the time, the need for us to polish our hearts and to have there be a relationship between our minds and our hearts that we practice in our bodies on this planet Earth, that's a need for everybody. It's not just for Muslims. So I'm really happy for this opportunity. Iran is on my bucket list. So should I ever get there, inshallah, maybe, you know, we can meet also in person. The problem is I don't want to be there in a way that's beyond being a tourist, because I don't want to be prevented. Oh, the lady imam is coming and da da da. But, you know, I do hope one day to come to Iran within the next few years, because I don't have that many years ahead of me. So I, you know, really, I enjoyed our conversation very much. So thank you.
روز خوبی داشته باشید. خداحافظ شما باشه.
Yeah, خداحافظ. Bye.